Good evening, everyone. Good evening. In an effort to respect your time, I am going to go ahead and get started with our presentation tonight. Welcome, everybody. And the United Steelworkers Civil and Human Rights Department is proud to present part one of our two-part series, Black Workers in the American Labor Movement, Reconstruction to Modern Day. My name is Brittany Murray, and I work in the Civil and Human Rights Department at the United Steelworkers headquarters. Tonight, we will learn about Black labor trailblazers, the legislation that tried to undermine Black citizens, and the triumphs of Black organizers. Without further ado, let's get started. Now, I know the title says Reconstruction to Modern Day, but for you to understand the events during Reconstruction, it is imperative you understand how and when our labor influence began here in America. We know our blood, sweat, and tears were exploited on this soil as hundreds of thousands of Africans made the perilous journey to these shores. But we also know that many of those enslaved were artisans, craftsmen, farmers, ironworkers, architects, mathematicians, and so much more. Slaveholders in the South would come to rely on the agricultural technologies of enslaved Africans to achieve economic security. Many Africans plundered from their homes were taken specifically for their knowledge and skill sets. Rice farmers from Gambia were taken from the African coast and brought to South Carolina's marshlands, transforming the landscape and building up a million-dollar industry during slavery. This knowledge and skill would be passed down from generation to generation. Ingenuity was not a foreign concept to many slaves, but it was often overlooked. On some rare occasions, the ingenuity would prove palpable. Domestically, enslaved Black people without access to patenting laws created and engineered a myriad of inventions with modern day descendants. Slaves couldn't engage in patent laws because they weren't considered citizens of the United States. In fact, until Reconstruction, not even free Blacks were considered United States nationals. Benjamin Montgomery would be one of these slaves during the era. Benjamin Montgomery invented a steamboat propeller that could more effectively cut through water as the boats navigated the rivers. As the purchasing and shipping operations overseer on the Davis plantation, Benjamin realized that every time a steamboat ran adrift, goods would be delayed for days, if not weeks. In an effort to address the issue, he created a propeller that could cut into water at different angles and led to better steerage of the ships. He would later attempt to patent his invention, but both he and his slave master were denied the patent. Benjamin couldn't get the patent due to his slave classification, and his slave master, John Davis, and brother of Confederate, he was the brother of the Confederacy, President Jefferson Davis, they were siblings. They couldn't get the patent because he was not the true inventor. This would later be the catalyst for Jefferson Davis to open his own patent office during the Civil War, which would actually allow enslaved citizens to have a recognized patent and trademark. It wasn't very successful though, given the war kept most citizens busy. It is through these technologies, innovations, and essential skills that Black labor would rise to prominence in specific industries and labor organizing would take hold in some communities. Enslaved and free Blacks both understood the necessity of their labor and rose to challenge the status quo on how their production would be utilized in America. Formed in 1838, Maryland's Caulkers Association is one of the first Black trade unions in the United States. Most members worked as caulkers, carpenters, and longshoremen. While much of the shipyard industry was dominated by a predominantly white workforce, early national era free Blacks began collectively bargaining with Baltimore shipyard owners and had a near monopoly on all caulking positions across multiple docks. Sorry, folks. I lost my technician for the evening, so I had to find a replacement, but please bear with us. I really appreciate it. Black caulkers were considered masters of their craft and were sought after for their diligence and knowledge. Black caulkers even earned more per hour than their white and often immigrant competition, which was astounding for that time. Most Black laborers were not earning more than the other white workers in any sector. Shipyard owners were reluctant to hire the white immigrant workers due to quality and productivity concerns. They recognized that the Black workers had honed their skills over several decades and had passed on wisdom and techniques between generations. The Caulkers Association would foster several Black labor activists during its tenure. And a fun fact, Frederick Douglass was actually a caulker in 1836 before escaping to freedom. He met Anna Murray in the Baltimore shipyard during his time as a caulker, and with her help, would later escape to New York in 1838, the year the association was founded. In 1858, gangs of white workers attacked Black caulkers in shipyards to intimidate owners into hiring their cheaper labor. A Baltimore white gang, known as the Tigers Club, spent days ruthlessly attacking Black dock workers. Some shipyard owners even attempted to shield the Black caulkers from the attacks by locking them in offices or in other areas on their properties. While these attacks led owners to be wary about hiring white caulkers, the threats allowed the encroachment of white gangs into caulking jobs and the displacement of Black workers within the shipyards. By 1860, Black caulkers had lost significant jobs in the sector, and the Black community had lost opportunities in their 9th highest occupation. In 1865, after emancipation, white workers staged a strike to force shipyards to terminate Black workers. The strikes were successful, and at least 100 Black caulkers and dock workers lost their jobs. This pattern of violence and ousting of Black labor would unfortunately become commonplace across the United States and spurred Black organizers to galvanize their communities and demand equal rights during Reconstruction. Now, Reconstruction was a tumultuous era following the Civil War. The politicians of the period would attempt to integrate and assimilate 4 million newly freed Black citizens, while also dealing with the integration of the Confederacy and growing white nationalism. On January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation declaring that all persons held as slaves are and henceforward shall be free. With the utterance of these words, Reconstruction began, and Congress would be tasked with creating a flurry of bills to repair the damaged Union and move the country forward. The additions of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments would grant enslaved Blacks freedom from slavery, citizenship and due process, and all Black males the right to vote, respectively. Freedom brought new organizing tactics, as well as more Blacks that could be unionized under a collective agreement. Due process granted every Black person protections under the law that were guaranteed to white constituents. With citizenship and naturalization, the door was open for Black politicians, and with Black males having the right to vote, many formerly enslaved found themselves eligible for public office. Soon, Black citizens will have access to over 2,000 African Americans holding public office, which is incredible. Nationally, Black workers were making strides in their labor organizing, with many associations, coalitions, and collaboratives cropping up across the country. Educated Black workers were entering the job market due to access to schools. Reconstruction would become the founding years for many historically Black colleges and universities. While multitudes of Black laborers hurried to secure their rights, some areas of rapid growth for Black organizing were along the country's coastlines and again at their docks. Chartered in 1869, the Longshoremen's Protective Union Association, LPUA, was comprised almost entirely of Black laborers at the Charleston, South Carolina docks. A series of strikes solidified the LPUA's influence over the docks in Charleston and led to increased wages for Black workers, a part of the association. The union would force employers to accept closed shop workforces and convince stevedores to join their ranks. They also secured the support of local politicians, both Democrat and Republican. The union would even organize stoppages for any shipping liner paying less than the union wage, and would not allow goods to exit the ships until an agreement was met between parties. All of this was a big deal in a state like South Carolina, who historically have been very anti-union and continue to be towards most sectors except these extremely well-organized dock workers. The LPUA would become an integral force across all of Charleston and be lauded and respected by the city, as well as other labor sectors such as phosphate, rice, and sawmills. In the late 19th century, a series of natural disasters and a crumbling port led to a decline in LPUA's membership in employer contracts. Growing white resentment and calls for an end to South Carolina's Reconstruction government weakened the union and severed ties with local politicians and community stakeholders. In 1900, the union's charter was not renewed and the LPUA's legacy came to a halt. Almost 40 years later, in 1936, George German would revitalize the defunct union and reorganize it under the American Federation of Labor's International Longshoremen Alliance. The LPUA would become ILA Local 1422, which is still operating to this very day in South Carolina. As an added tidbit, George German's grandfather, William German, a former slave on a rice shipping vessel, was a part of the 1869 group that incorporated Black dock workers under the LPUA. His grandson, George, returned from World War I to do the same through the AFL's ILA Local 1422. That is one very accomplished Black family. Now, taking things back a bit, during the time the South Carolina longshoremen chartered their union, America was in a period of growth and forming labor federations and coalitions. One of them was the National Labor Union, founded in 1866 by William Silvis. The National Labor Union called on Congress to mandate an 8-hour workday, for which Ulysses S. Grant would draft a proclamation for in 1869. Moreover, the NLU asserted unorganized and newly freed Blacks would undermine white labor via exploitation by employers. The union understood that if former enslaved workers weren't included in their ranks, they would ultimately usurp jobs due to their cheap labor. Prior to the NLU, all non-white and non-male workers had been excluded from labor unions and associations. In 1869, the first Black delegates attended a National Labor Union convention in Philadelphia. It was the first time a major labor entity had requested free Blacks to join their assembly. At the convention, a NLU committee stated, and I quote, "The interests of labor are one. Any discrimination on either racial or religious grounds is harmful to all working men." Unfortunately, and often too commonplace, many of the NLU's white constituent unions objected to allowing membership to Blacks, and the divide between Black and white labor widened without a coordinated campaign to integrate. Black organizers, such as Isaac Myers, would make notable attempts at convincing the membership that integration was necessary if the labor movement wanted to solidify its role in the United States economy. As was common, these pleas fell on deaf ears, and Myers and other Black members would be forced to form their own organization. Only 4 years after the Philadelphia Convention, the National Labor Union would dissolve in 1873. Speaking of Isaac Myers, he was one of the most prolific and formidable labor organizers during Reconstruction. He had been a caulker when strikes from white workers forced Black laborers off the docks, and with economic support from the Black community, he founded a dry dock in Baltimore. By 1868, he was president of the Colored Caulkers Trade Union and utilized that position to bring together Black workers and other trades to organize under the newly formed federation, the aforementioned National Labor Union. He was one of the 8 Black delegates seated at the NLU convention in Philadelphia. Speaking on behalf of the Black delegates, he spoke passionately on the common interest between Black and white workers surrounding wages, organizing, and work hours. He was met with considerable applause, but no action. NLU leadership wouldn't risk their political positions to address the inequitable treatment of Black members. Due to this maltreatment, Isaac Myers and many others would become some of the founding members of the Colored National Labor Union. In a direct quote from his 1869 speech, Myers said, "I speak today for the colored men of the whole country, when I tell you that all they ask for themselves is a fair chance, that you shall be no worse off by giving them that chance. The white men of the country have nothing to fear. We desire to have the highest rate of wages that our labor is worth." The Colored National Union was founded in December of 1869, 3 short months after the NLU's convention, and had an assembly of 214 Black workers from varying sectors and industries. The union's goal was to establish equal representation and workforce conditions for Black workers and to draft new charters of Black unions and associations to rival other white labor entities. This time, during Reconstruction, solidified Black workers' resolve in being recognized by the government and other national labor federations. In January of 1871, a convention was held by the CNLU in Washington, D.C. The Colored National Labor Convention petitioned Congress by sending, and I quote, a memorial of the Committee of the National Labor Convention. The CNLU wanted Congress to appoint a commission to inquire into the conditions and affairs in the Southern states, where many Black laborers did not yet have access to labor unions. The CNLU knew it was imperative to initiate strong organizing efforts and labor unions in the South if the union wanted to see newly freed slaves granted workers' rights and fair employment. Congress showed little to no interest in their initiatives. The Colored National Labor Union would collapse 2 years later during the Depression of 1873. Beginning in Europe, the Depression made its way across the Atlantic and decimated a multitude of labor organizations and their efforts, regardless of race. Isaac Myers would go on to found the Colored Men's Progressive and Cooperative Union, which welcomed workers of all backgrounds, including women. He would spend a few years organizing in the South before returning home to Baltimore in 1880. He died in 1891 at the age of 56, and there is now a maritime park dedicated to both him and Frederick Douglass in Baltimore, Maryland. Douglass was actually president of the CNLU at the time of its collapse. The end of Reconstruction and the beginning of Jim Crow came in 1877, 4 short years after the CNLU disbanded. By 1896, the Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, would officially recognize the doctrine of separate but equal, relegating Blacks to second-class citizenship and undermining their attempts at integrating into white union strongholds. Many times when discussing the end of Reconstruction, historians will point to a short period where Black labor in the South appeared to be making significant gains. The term 40 acres and a mule was coined during the Civil War when Blacks cultivated land abandoned by whites throughout the South. In 1863, President Lincoln ordered 20,000 acres of abandoned Confederate land be sold to newly freed slaves in 20-acre parcels. Salmon Chase, the Union Secretary of the Treasury, expanded the parcels from 20 to 40 acres and agreed to loan army mules to Black laborers working the land. By 1865, 40,000 formerly enslaved persons lived on 400,000 acres of coastal land in South Carolina and Georgia alone. The impact on newly freed slaves' access to land across the South would be even greater. Facilitating all these land sales and support programs across the South was the United States Freedmen Bureau. The Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, most notably known as the Freedmen's Bureau, was made up of Black and white Civil War soldiers and was established by Congress through the Freedmen Bureau Act of 1865. Head of the commission, Oliver Otis Howard, a Union general and West Point graduate, and a Black man, would oversee the Bureau's efficacy from Washington, D.C., while assistant commissioners and hundreds of agents would set out to assist millions of former slaves and poor whites in the South. Freedmen Bureau agents acted as social workers and federal representatives after the Civil War. They would become essential figures in the day-to-day lives of newly freed slaves and poor white loyalists to the Union. Agents fed millions of people, built hospitals, offered legal assistance, and negotiated labor contracts for former slaves. The Bureau also settled labor disputes, assisted Black veterans, legalized marriages for former slaves, and aided them in locating lost relatives. They also kept detailed records that contained a wide range of data on Black citizens' experiences during slavery and Reconstruction, and we still point to that data today. The Bureau would go on to build thousands of schools for newly freed Black citizens and raise multiple historically Black colleges and universities from the ground up. A fun note, Freedmen Bureau's Commissioner Oliver Otis Howard would found Howard University in 1867 and served as the university's president from 1869 to 1874. And that would be the Howard University, still operating in Washington, D.C. Initially, the Freedmen's Bureau was only supposed to be in existence during the Civil War and 1 year after. However, Congress entered a bill to extend the Bureau's tenure in 1866. Its only opponents were ex-Confederates and President Andrew Johnson, who vetoed the bill. Congress and President Johnson were embroiled in a bitter battle over Reconstruction era programs, including the Freedmen's Bureau. Johnson would veto many bills aimed at supporting newly freed slaves on the grounds that it would supersede states' rights, be a huge financial burden to the government, and give preference to one group of citizens over the other, i.e. Black citizens. In July of 1866, Congress was able to get the bill passed with revisions. However, the battle between Congress and Johnson would only fuel racist sentiments in the South, and the Freedmen's Bureau's power and efficacy would slowly suffer the ramifications. The Freedmen's Bureau continued its sale of land to newly freed slaves, and Congress intended to expand the program and capitalize on any revenue by issuing new parcels across the South. Eventually, President Andrew Johnson intervened on behalf of ex-Confederates he had pardoned and ordered the confiscated land to be returned to its former owners, regardless of whether Black laborers had settled on it or not. The Freedmen's Bureau would be disbanded a short time later in 1872. President Andrew's order was the first of many crippling acts against Black citizens and workers. Johnson often pointed to the passage of the 14th Amendment, in which former slaves became eligible to participate in the Southern Homestead Act of 1866. However, the price of settling was too expensive for tenant farmers and sharecroppers. Southern Black laborers lived in dire poverty, and much of the land offered under the act was unsuitable and difficult to find. There was also the existing extreme hostility and terroristic violence directed at former slaves by whites that kept many from pursuing use of the act. The creation of Black codes forced Black workers into oppressive labor contracts and service positions across the South. Without a Freedmen's Bureau, there wouldn't be anyone around to protect them. Black labor activists would spend decades attempting to undermine these contracts. Without support from Congress or any national labor unions, Black workers were left to organize for themselves or suffer under work conditions comparable to that of slavery. So organize they did. New Orleans Black labor was first organized into the Longshoremen's Protective Union Benevolent Association, or the LPUBA, in 1872. In the early 1900s, Black and white dock workers came to a half and half agreement by which all dock workers, that would be the longshoremen, screwmen, and roustabouts, had to employ equal numbers of Black and white workers. Other ethnic racial groups were assigned somewhat randomly to white or Black. They wouldn't receive their own codifications until well into the next century. This prevented bosses from hiring workers of the other race to scab when they were on strike, which had often happened before. New Orleans Black organizer A.J. Ellis would be quoted saying, "We, the colored screwmen, have not departed from any of our agreements except that we were tired of being used as an instrument to starve our brother workmen." The half and half agreement gave Black workers political power in the financial and commercial center of the Deep South just years into the Jim Crow government. Its ramifications and practices were felt across the country. The New Orleans Black Dock Workers Union was the largest Black union in the country in the early 1900s. During a union strike in 1907, the union's executive committee was made up of 12 white and 12 Black screwmen, a fact that shocked C.C. Cordell, a Louisiana senator at the time. An astonished Cordell would later go on to be quoted saying, "Do I understand you to say that 12 white men and 12 Negroes dominate the commerce of this port? Well, we are practically under Negro government." End quote. Regardless of the senator's sentiments, Black workers in other areas of the South had already initiated their fights for labor freedom. In 1881, 20 laundresses met and organized a collective to advocate for higher pay and better working conditions. In less than 1 month, the laundresses' ranks grew from 20 to 30,000 workers, and a strike was formed. Within that same time frame, local authorities were taking action against the laundresses through arrests and fines. They even tried to implement a $25 annual organizing fee on the workers, which was several months of wages at the time. Undeterred, the laundresses responded with a letter to local politicians that stated in bold letters, and I quote, "We mean business or no washing." And no, seriously, that's all the letter said. Influenced by the laundresses, other domestic Black workers, from cooks to maids to hotel workers, rose into action to demand fairer wages as well as better working conditions. Now, employers were keenly aware of how Black labor unrest could eviscerate profits for their businesses, and with other workers coming on board, economic upheaval was imminent. The strikes came at a particularly bad time for local businesses, as it was mere weeks away from a World Fair in Atlanta. Thus, the area employers applied pressure on the city council to reject the proposed fees only a week later. The strike cemented the all Black female workers as integral to the South's new economy and workforce. However, even with these localized wins in organizing, the overall labor conditions in the South remain bleak for millions of Black workers. Sharecropping and tenant farming remained the predominant occupation for Black laborers in the South. For African Americans who did not own land, the practices of sharecropping and tenant farming were essentially another form of slavery. In sharecropping, landowners, who were primarily white, assigned families land to farm in exchange for food, shelter, clothing, and farming equipment. When the land was harvested and goods sold, owners deducted a furnishing tax for room and board, giving the meager amount of remaining cash to Black farmers. By 1930, there were still 2 million tenant farmers in the South. After severe crop losses and ever-increasing violence at the hands of white mobs, many Black laborers felt moving to the North was integral to their overall survival. Due to white racism, Black citizens were being lynched, harassed, kicked off their lands, and oppressed under rampant injustice. Furthermore, Black press in the North urged Southern laborers to migrate for better job opportunities and safety. They touted better education, housing, and demographic density in the northern cities, perfect for organizing. Labor agents were also sent south by northern industry to recruit Black Southerners to break strikes in the North. They came offering better wages and working conditions. All of these factors would precipitate Black workers heading north in the Great Migration. The Great Migration was one of the largest movements of people in United States history. It would last from 1910 through the 1970s and come in two waves. Black migrants moved from the American South to the North, Midwest, and Western states. Unskilled laborers and workers with families made up the largest population of migrants. There were not only jobs and education in these other cities, but also hope for union participation. Black migrants weren't just escaping low wages and poor working conditions in the South, but rising violence from right terrorist organizations that were founded during Reconstruction. While Black migrants have been aware of Black settlements in the North and were able to find jobs, they still face injustices and segregation in the workplace and the Northern unions. Many were still unable to break into some industries and were often relegated to being strikebreakers during labor disputes. Black workers went on to fill labor voids during World War I and made significant gains in steel, meatpacking, automobile, and shipping industries, all areas where Black labor is still crucial today. The Red Summer of 1919 was rooted in prejudice and tensions arising from white people having to adjust to the demographic changes. Racial violence would impact some 26 cities across the United States, most of which had been destinations for Southern migrants seeking work. World War I veterans were returning home to a type of violence all too familiar. And the summer would become widely known as one of the deadliest in this nation's history due to white racist assault on Black citizens, mass lynchings, and a series of violent bouts between white people and Black folks that took up arms to protect themselves. Any gains made by Black labor during the first migration wave were short-lived, as the Great Depression would soon upend economic security and job growth. The Great Depression began in 1929 and lasted until 1939. The Depression was precipitated by economic conditions that led to the stock market crash of 1929. Black labor activists had worked relentlessly to try and bridge the gaps in working conditions and wages for Black workers. But shortly after the beginning of the Depression, their efforts would crumble. During the Depression, Black unemployment soared to 50%, twice the national average of their white counterparts. Even before the Depression, Black workers were not equally protected in employment, housing, or the criminal justice system. Thus, unlawful terminations, evictions, and arrests increased with the desperation of the times. Having left the rural South, Black migrants were now stuck in northern and western cities and would have to compete more fervently with their white counterparts for jobs. Even still, some 2 million Southern migrants would move north and into the West during this period. Some jobs in which Black workers were relegated, such as the sleeping car porters, acted as a safe haven for Black jobs during and after the Depression. Porters on Western trains were often considered some of the best paid in their communities while having the worst jobs on the trains. This was the case for some members of my own maternal family during the Depression, who operated a honey dipper business for outhouses across rural southwestern Pennsylvania. A honey dipper was a person that came and cleaned outhouses, which were essentially just holes in the ground that people urinated and defecated into. As the saying goes, somebody's got to do it. In 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office as president of the United States and arrived with a plan, a New Deal for America that would turn things around, hopefully. President Roosevelt envisioned policies to stimulate the economy, fair paying jobs, and programs to bring about a much needed recovery for the American worker. This New Deal era occurred largely between 1933 and 1939 with the passage of legislation to help working people, such as the Social Security Act of 1935, the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, and the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. The Social Security Act of 1935 created provisions for the general welfare of the nation and social insurance for retired workers. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935 guaranteed the right of private sector workers to organize in the trade unions. And the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 created the right to minimum wage, overtime pay, and prohibited child labor. Even with these laws, Black workers in the North and South still labored under unequal rights and working conditions. The Roosevelt administration appointed a number of Black people to federal office, but did not support racial equality for fear of losing the vote of white Southern Democrats. Therefore, Black citizens were still discriminated against and excluded from many New Deal programs. Most of the programs under the New Deal were administered locally. Thus, local sentiments and biases would serve as the parameter as to whether Black citizens received support or didn't. While workers in the North rallied to be included in trade unions, workers in the South did not benefit from the National Labor Relations Act. During the debate on the NLRA, congressional Southern Democrats argued ferociously for the exclusion of Black Southern agricultural and domestic workers, the largest sectors of Black labor in the South. Several politicians also alluded to Black workers, even those in the North, not reaping any benefits and protections listed under the act. They were outwardly signaling that they would attempt to deter Black unionization in any way possible. The primary sponsor of the NLRA bill, Robert Wagner, had colluded with the American Federation of Labor's president, William Green, to defeat a provision in the NLRA that would not permit a union to run a closed shop if it discriminated on the basis of race. Essentially, the AFL and Wagner would keep labor equality between the races out of the bill. The provision to ensure the nation's unions wouldn't discriminate was defeated before the bill's historical passage. The US government and employers continued to perpetuate racial segregation to oust Black labor forces nationally. Labor organizations were often just as complicit in the segregation of workers, but undeterred, Black organizers would work relentlessly for the next several decades to form progressive unions and demand fair treatment from national labor unions. When Black organizers did become members of these unions, they would take their fight to union committees, leadership, and even to their hallowed conventions. The American Federation of Labor was founded in 1886. During the early 1900s, the AFL would recruit and accredit a multitude of sectors from the North and the South. Many of the locals were full of Black workers. This quickly grew staunch opposition from white workers affiliated with the AFL, and they would spend decades attempting to create hardship and racial ousting of Black workers from the AFL. At the AFL's 1934 annual convention, Delegate Robert E. Burford of the Freight Handlers, Express, and Station Employees Union would outline unequal conditions and the barring of 100,000 Black laborers, all of which fell under the jurisdiction of the Brotherhood of Railway and Steamship Clerks, an AFL affiliate. Delegate Burford's resolution outlined that the affiliate union's constitution stated that only white members were eligible, whereas the AFL's constitution does not bar any worker on the basis of race. His argument was that the affiliates that refused to admit Black workers and the AFL were diametrically opposed via their own constitutions. 3 years later, during the AFL's convention of 1937, A. Philip Randolph, a delegate from the Brotherhood of Sleeping Cars, submitted a resolution against racial inequality and discrimination towards Blacks to the vast membership of the AFL. The resolution again outlined ongoing discrimination within the AFL's affiliate unions and their refusal or ousting of Black workers from the rank and file. The Black Workers Resolution demanded the AFL make a bold proclamation in the face of overt racism and stop evading the question of Negro rights and trade unions. The resolution also demanded the AFL expel any unions that barred entry of Negroes into their ranks. As an argument, the Black workers cited the AFL's ability to use its own constitution to justify the expulsion of 10 labor unions that had made up the Committee for Industrial Organization, also referred to as the CIO, due to still organizing and democratic union procedures just 2 months prior. The Black workers were making it plain. If the AFL could oust the CIO for wanting to organize steel via the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, then it could expel racist unions from its federation. The Congress of Industrial Organization was founded after its 10 affiliate unions were expelled from the American Federation of Labor in 1937. Once the beacon of progressive labor and the civil rights movement in the 30s, the CIO took a drastic shift in 1947 with new Cold War leadership. By 1949, the CIO would expel 9 of its unions, all with significant Black labor density that had been retained before and during World War II. Many of the CIO's affiliated unions with the highest amount of Black workers were left-led and thus had grown their organizing through affiliation and support from communist organizers and the Communist Party. In 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act passed in Congress and will require all federations and their affiliations to sign an anti-communist affidavit stating they were not a part of the Communist Party. The CIO initially advised union leadership to refuse signing Section 9 of the Taft-Hartley Act, but would eventually cave due to provisions inside the act that made it illegal for unions to access National Labor Relations Board machinery if they didn't sign. Unions that refused to sign were expelled from the CIO, and their locals were raided by both CIO and AFL organizers. These unions had some of the highest Black worker density in the country, and several were under the guidance of Black leadership and organizers. Some unions would later reinstate underneath the AFL-CIO, but the damage done to their rank and file during the expulsion was swift and severe. Please take a brief moment to read the list of unions that were expelled, and you will likely deduce for yourselves why they had such a high number of Black members. Chartered in 1937 by the CIO under the Cannery Workers Union, the food, tobacco, agricultural, and allied workers were a fierce group of predominantly Black, Asian, and Hispanic members nationally. Galvanized by the emergence of the CIO in 1937, Black organizers in the FTA took the lead in campaigns that saw strong labor movement and the re-enfranchisement of neglected Southern workers as keys to reforming the South. The FTA had an intentional communist program of advancing women of color into leadership, a practice that began in the beet fields and canneries of California among migrant Filipino, Japanese, and Mexican workers. This practice would be extended to Americans in the South, where Black workers were the predominant labor class. The FTA was led by a cadre of dedicated Black and white communist organizers. The organizers, unafraid, took on the prevailing political power of the ruling white supremacist establishment in Tennessee, Florida, North Carolina, and other localities throughout the South. One of these revolutionaries was named Miranda Smith, and she will be our final trailblazer of the evening. And a personal favorite of mine, I was really excited to be able to share with all of you Miranda Smith's story. She is an icon and a legend, and I really hope that you all leave from here and keep studying her. But Miranda Smith was the Southern Regional Director and a part of the Local 22 leadership of the Food, Tobacco, and Agricultural Allied Union, or the FTA. For almost a decade, Miranda Smith had worked as a stemmer, or in her words, and I quote, slave by another name, tearing tobacco leaves off of their stalks with her bare hands in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Later, she would become one of the fiercest Black communist labor organizers across the South. Miranda led Local 22 in Winston-Salem through successful strikes in 1943 and 1947. In 1947, she was elected to the FDA's executive committee, making her the first Black woman to hold an executive position on the board of an international labor union. In 1949, she would become the union's Southern Regional Director. She led voters' drives that registered thousands of first-time Black voters. She also spoke out against Jim Crow segregation and had unnerving run-ins with the Ku Klux Klan. She would face them bravely when the times called for it. Miranda pressed for civil rights legislation from the North Carolina Assembly to Congress and helped reorganize the Winston-Salem chapter of the NAACP. In the end, she organized at least 10,000 other tobacco workers in the region. During the FDA's expulsion from the CIO, she would travel her entire southern region by bus, often staying with rank and file members and eating in segregated counters to try and defend the FDA from raids and hostile takeovers by both the CIO and the AFL. Miranda would tragically die from a stroke at the age of 34 in 1950. She had one of the largest funerals in Winston-Salem history. And with that, this presentation and what I've put together for you this evening is coming to a close. And I hope each of you found these stories, forgotten heroes in the history of this nation, to be inspiring, gripping, and a reminder that many of these battles are still being fought. If we do not know our history, we are assuredly doomed to repeat it. I want to end our time together with a brief video showcasing Black labor, our movement, and the reasons why we fight for it all. Thank you, and please enjoy this brief glimpse into our past lives.
I'm gonna ride down the line all night, ride till the morning light, make it alright. Been working so hard, a hungry fight. Back up and grab a bite, grab a bite. If I lose, can't be worse than all these blues. I heard it said on the evening news, forecast predictions, you fucking fool. Someday I'll get to the other side. Get to the other side, swallow my pride. There's one to do, kind of numb was I for you. And if I lose, can't be worse than all these blues.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Please do, again, please tune in next Thursday at 7 p.m. EST. If you registered for this You will be able to use that link to get into the presentation next week. Please show up and show my coworker, Marsha Zakowski, some love, and please enjoy the rest of your Black History Month. Have a great night, folks.
Good evening, everyone. And my name is Marsha Zakowski, and I serve as a senior technician in the United Steelworkers Civil and Human Rights Department. I want to thank you all for joining us for part 2 of our department's Black History Month program, Black Workers in the American Labor Movement, Reconstruction to Modern Day. Part 2 is going to cover the 1960s through today, and continues the history of how Black activists, workers, and leaders not only help build our country's infrastructure, but our American labor movement into the strongest and greatest and only representative movement for workers today. The events of the 1960s in particular still resonate with us today as an inspiration of what we can accomplish for economic security and social justice for all workers and people in our country. Looking back, there we go. Looking back at the 1950s and 60s, it was a time of turbulence and continued struggle to end segregation that you heard about in part 1, and discrimination in public accommodations that excluded African Americans or Blacks, discrimination in housing, and in particular, discrimination in employment. The time had come for national action for legislation that would end Jim Crow laws so everyone could live in a country of equal opportunity, regardless of their race, their color, or the color of their skin. A. Philip Randolph, also known as the Dean of Black Unionists, again led the charge, in particular regarding racial exclusion in local unions. Randolph was a vice president and member of the AFL-CIO after the merger of the AFL and the CIO, and president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He was more than frustrated after and he was also on the council of the organization. He was more than frustrated after a 1959 AFL-CIO convention vote reaffirmed that the organization would still tolerate segregated locals, in particular, craft and construction unions that had their own hiring halls. After that event, he formed and founded the Negro American Labor Council, also known as NELC, to organize Black workers with the goal of abolishing the color line in every institution, from unions to schools to sports to government. In May of 1960, at the founding convention, and just a little anecdote to that, the Black Union women who were delegates there, seeing that the board of NELC were all male, they protested and won 2 seats on the board. So all organizations, even if they're civil rights organizations or Black organizations or women's organizations, aren't perfect. That same month, Randolph again called for the elimination of segregated locals affiliated with the AFL-CIO. As a result of that, he was actually censored by its executive board. By 1962, membership in his new organization that actually was part of the AFL-CIO, like an extension, began to decline, and it fell from 10,000 members in its chapters to 4,000. However, the following year, NELC was the organization that initiated its best known action, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. In January of 1963, Randolph called on his longtime and old friend, Bayard Rustin, who was a civil rights strategist and controversial political theorist, to organize the march, including the logistics of getting people there, providing food and rest areas for all that came. He was asked to develop a proposal that would be sent to win support from both civil rights and labor leaders. By the end of July 1963, he had organized, with the help of local unions and religious and all kinds of organizations, 2,000 buses, 21 trains, and 10 airplanes chartered. That was enough for 115,000 marchers. So he expected a big turnout. Some leaders of Black organizations didn't want Rustin actually in the forefront of the civil rights movement or the march due to a past incident when he was arrested on a moral charge involving his sexuality that led to his public coming out. So for the movement and to put the movement first, he stayed in the background and actually was almost written out of civil rights history. He joined the LGBT community, and years later, in 1986, he testified on behalf of the New York State Gay Rights Bill, and he died the following year. In 2013, the 50th anniversary of the march, President Obama posthumously awarded Rustin the President's Medal of Freedom. I've been with the Steelworkers a long time. Some of you may know that. I was privileged to have heard Mr. Rustin speak several times and to meet him and to get to know him just a little bit, just from my work in the union, including when he was featured at our International Civil Rights Conference in mid-1970s. He was a pacifist, but he was a kind and gentle man who spoke not only for Blacks, but all people, and all his speeches reflected that. He wasn't speaking as a Black man, he was speaking as a man for workers and for the betterment of everyone. Another labor leader that was involved in the march and one of the key organizers of the march was Ed Nixon. He was a member of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the same as Mr. Randolph. After Rosa, he was very instrumental in organizing the Montgomery boycott. After Rosa Parks' arrest for refusing to give up her bus seat, he organized the boycott in which the city's Black citizens refused to ride public transportation for an astounding 381 days. He had a natural ability to organize and to rally people around a cause, and that's why they wanted him. The boycott was a success, and he too has generally been overlooked by historians, and his importance in the bus boycott has been downplayed by some participants associated with it. During that time, Martin Luther King's home was bombed, and so was Ed Nixon's. That's how violent and the hatred was back then, to actually go out and kill people. And you'll find out, of course, that's what happened later. The call in 2 years after the march, Randolph and Rustin got together and went on to co-found the A. Philip Randolph Institute, which was the first and is the senior constituency organization of the AFL-CIO. And they forged a strong alliance of civil rights and labor. They strengthened it and pulled together actions where both movements would work together, like before and after the march. This is the official button for the march. There were hundreds others. This is actually a collector's item. And on your right is the actual program for the march, which I don't know if there's copies anywhere of that. You can always find that online. There was only one labor leader on the program invited to speak, and that was Walter Reuther, who was president of the Auto Workers, which at the time was the largest industrial union in the country, followed by the United Steelworkers. He was a co-founder of the AFL-CIO with George Meany, who became president. But more than that, Reuther believed in societal change through nonviolent civil disobedience, and was obviously, through that, a powerful ally of Martin Luther King for the labor movement. When Dr. King and others, including children, were jailed in Birmingham, Alabama, Reuther arranged $160,000, and that was back then, for their release. The UAW also paid for an expensive sound system and thousands of signs so voices would ring out all over the Washington Mall. Other unions as well gave money and supported the march, not only by participating, but also they gave quite a bit of financial support, which was important to the success of the march. Now, even though George Meany and the AFL-CIO supported the cause and goals of the march, the organization did not endorse it. It took a neutral position. It took a neutral position because some leaders of the AFL-CIO feared that people would get hurt, or it would get violent, in other words, and it would bring resentment from some members of Congress who were needed to win support for civil rights legislation labor supported. Reuther died in a plane crash in 1970, and he was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1995 by President Clinton. The march was the largest political rally of the civil rights movement. It might have been, it probably was the largest rally of all in this country. The call for passage of President Kennedy's proposed civil rights bill that labor supported was one of the key demands of the march, along with minimum wage of $2 that today would be equivalent to $17 or maybe a little more, an expansion of the Fair Labor Standards Act to include majority Black occupations at the time, like domestic workers. I love this photo. It's one of my favorites of the 1963 headline, in anticipation of what became the largest civil rights gathering in history, as I mentioned. And I wanted to add it for that reason. This is the most famous photo of 250,000 marchers at the Lincoln Memorial who came from all over the country. And they came, labor included. The unions came, 40,000 of them. Many national unions had endorsed the march and were important supporters, not only of the movement, but were in the forefront for the passage of the Civil Rights Act. The auto workers, of course, 1199, the drug and hospital workers, and many internationals as well. The painters, the hotel and club employees, the postal workers, the steelworkers, my union, and even though it wasn't endorsed, the AFL-CIO Industrial Union Department, which Walter Reuther headed. And they came with their signs for all the demands, the signs that were made by the auto workers, the signs that were provided by other unions and other organizations. There's thousands of photos about the march. Going back, when I mentioned my union and the auto workers, both unions had extensive links with civil rights causes, provided financial assistance, and both unions had representatives on boards of civil rights organizations. And both unions had created internal, by constitution, by their union constitution, local union fair employment or civil rights committees to examine the dynamics of racism in their own unions. And today, the UAW and the Steelworkers have two of the most progressive and best structured civil rights programs, from the international through our districts, in their case unions, to our local unions, to deal with discrimination. Most people only remember the march as the one where Dr. King gave his historic "I Have a Dream" speech. But what we saw on that day achieved the most far-reaching national gains for Black workers and unionists. Afterwards, the leaders of the march went to see President Kennedy at the White House, presented their demands. There were actually 10 of them that Bayard Rustin developed for the march. And in June 1963, before the march occurred, President Kennedy had asked Congress for a comprehensive civil rights bill. He was assassinated before it was passed. So his predecessor in 1964, or his successor in 1964, President Johnson, signed the legislation, which was landmark legislation called the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That act was the most important piece of legislation to protect workers from discrimination because of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And its Title VII covers employment, which is important to us as workers and as unionists. It's illegal for employers and unions to discriminate, including in hiring, firing, and promotion. Most of us didn't know this, but the protection for sex that was included in the act was actually added as an amendment by a Southern segregationist, Representative Howard Smith, a Democrat from Virginia. He was one of the Southern Democrats that Johnson had to deal with and try to appease. He thought it would sound so ridiculous to put it in that it would kill the bill's chances of passing. But his malicious joke backfired because women's rights advocates and women members of Congress went to President Johnson, who actually supported the amendment, and it passed. Now, following that, there was a lot of litigation. The bill was tested in every level of the court system. And I don't have time to go into what all these are, but it was expanded and clarified by the Pregnancy Discrimination Act regarding sex discrimination, the Civil Rights Act of 1991, where people who felt their rights were violated could actually go to a trial by jury, and the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. A recent Supreme Court decision, Bostock, that ruled discrimination because of sexual orientation and gender identity made it under the law unlawful to discriminate because of sex discrimination. In other words, discrimination because of sexual orientation and gender identity is actually sex discrimination. President Johnson at the time also signed the Housing Act bill in the 60s, 1968, which banned discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of property, which was one of the demands of the march. Legislation is a big part of this because it was so important, because it all happened during this time that I'm covering. The Civil Rights Act, Title VII, which covers employment, as I mentioned, established a government agency called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Many of you have heard of it. I'm sure you know what it is. And that's where eligible employees could file complaints of employment discrimination, whether they had a union or they didn't have a union, whether they had a grievance procedure or had no representation at all. However, the EEOC, when it was established, was limited to informal resolution methods of conciliation and persuasion with employers who were the main culprits at the time of discrimination. So in 1972, Congress passed the Equal Employment Opportunity Act that gave the EEOC the rights to the courts to litigate on behalf of an injured employee or complainant if it found that the complaint had reasonable cause of discrimination. In other words, they could take a case actually to court on behalf of a group of people, a class of people, or an individual, depending on what the discrimination was. So if you think of the millions of unorganized workers in this country that suffer discrimination every day, from then till now, they have a way, if they even know about it, they have recourse of a government agency because of the Civil Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act is another landmark piece of legislation that was signed also in 1965 and outlawed discriminatory voting practices adopted in many Southern states after the Civil War, including literacy tests as a prerequisite to voting. The Voting Rights Act enforced the 15th Amendment, and it had an immediate impact. By the end of 1965, 250,000 new Black voters had been registered. By the end of 1966, only 4 out of 13 Southern states had fewer than 50% of African Americans registered to vote. Now, when any legislation that's signed, any part of it could easily be signed away. It can be weakened or it can be strengthened. On June 25, 2018, the Supreme Court in Shelby versus Holder effectively struck down the heart of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 by a 5-4 vote, freeing 9 states, mostly in the South, to change their election laws without advance federal approval, which they had to have under the act. Today, we are still in the fight for voting rights, fighting against voter identity laws, and I'm sure you know all the things that are happening to disenfranchise workers, particularly in certain communities where there's a concentration of marginalized people in those kinds of communities. In mid-2023, the Supreme Court will be deciding regarding the Voting Rights Act, whether it is necessary, regarding voting rights, whether it is necessary to preserve the ability for citizens to challenge the redrawing of a voting district map in court if they feel their rights have been violated. The right to remedy is crucial in protecting the rights of all citizens to vote, including against discrimination in voting based on race, religion, or any other protected class. This ruling will likely not be issued until mid-2023. As I said, usually the decisions come down in June. In the meantime, unions and labor in general are supporting the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to help safeguard against all forms of voter suppression. Don't know if that'll ever come to pass, but we're working on it. In covering this period, it's really hard to leave out this particular event in Black workers' history. Though it's hardly mentioned, on February 1st, 1968, on an especially windy, rainy, stormy afternoon, Memphis city sanitation workers, Echo Cole and Robert Walker, had to take shelter from the rough wind and rain in the back of their garbage truck when the truck malfunctioned. They were pulled into the compactor heads first and died a gruesome death, and their mangled bodies had to be pulled out. Memphis City had a racist city policy that forced Black garbage men into the backs of trucks in bad weather. City rules barred shelter stops in residential neighborhoods after citizens complained about unsightly, quote unquote, picnics by the Black sanitation workers. For years, Black sanitation workers had complained about unsafe working conditions and poverty wages. And at least 3 times in 1963, 64, and 66, they faced retaliation from bosses while trying to unionize or to even go on strike. The deaths of these 2 workers became the last straw. On February 12th, 1968, hundreds of sanitation workers failed to show up for work. They demanded a raise, better working conditions, and union recognition. Dr. King came a few weeks later to support the 1,300 strikers, and that, as many of you know, is where he gave his "I've been to the mountaintop" speech, and where on April 4th, 1968, he was gunned down on a motel balcony. Another thing Johnson did, whatever you think of Johnson, he did do some great things in the area of civil rights. In 1965, he issued an executive order 11246 that required all government contractors and subcontractors to take affirmative action to expand job opportunities for minorities, Blacks, mainly Blacks, Hispanics, people of color, and women. He established the Office of Federal Contract Compliance. It was established as part of the law, actually, in the Department of Labor to administer the order. Many large industrial unions and shipbuilders and steel makers and auto workers and other industries had government contracts. Also, it led to affirmative action. The laws brought hundreds of grievances and plant-by-plant litigation under Title VII employment and the order covering government contractors regarding the underutilization of Black workers in higher paying jobs, particularly the trade and craft, like trade and craft jobs. In 1974, my union, the United Steelworkers, and 9 basic steel companies that we had at the time, and appropriate governmental agencies negotiated an industry-wide solution to this underutilization of Black workers. A judge was asked to enter the decree, and that was Judge Pointer, as he's known. Departmental seniority in steel plants back then gave Black workers, kept Black workers stuck in undesirable production jobs they were hired into. Once they were hired into that department, they stayed in that department. They were the dirtiest, toughest jobs in a steel mill. And they couldn't transfer from their department to another department for a better job. What this decree did was establish plant-wide seniority for all workers, including the retention of pay rates after someone transferred. If the pay rate to where they transferred was less, they would keep the pay rate they had. Goals for minorities, which were Blacks, Hispanics, and women, were established, and there was a back pay settlement. As a result, Black representation in higher jobs increased in the 4 years of the decree. The hiring of the same groups increased, especially for women who had been kept out of steel mills once they left the steel mills after World War II. So the representation of minorities and Blacks increased, and upward mobility increased. An audit and review committee was established. This actually is a very complicated document and process. It was to implement the decree. My administrative vice president, international vice president of the Steelworkers, Dave McCall, was one of the A&R implementers at his Bethlehem plant in Indiana. Affirmative action plans. You don't even hear much about affirmative action these days, do you? Affirmative action plans were tested in the Supreme Court, different from consent decrees that were ordered or used as or negotiated as a settlement. One case involved a steelworkers negotiated voluntary affirmative action plan it had with Kaiser Aluminum. The question before the court was, that's why I focus on how important these laws are, and we can't let them ever be weakened. Title VII, does Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prohibit a voluntary race-conscious affirmative action plan collectively bargained by an employer and a union to eliminate racial imbalances in traditionally segregated job categories. The negotiated plan reserved 50% of the openings in an in-plant craft training program for Black employees until the percentage of Black craft workers in the plant met the percentage of Blacks in the local labor force. The percentage also included Hispanics and women, but the higher percentage of the 50% were for Black workers. This plant was in Gramercy, Louisiana, and Brian Weber, a white employee, challenged the plan that gave junior Black workers preference over senior white workers. The case was labeled a reverse discrimination case, you might have heard that term, by newspaper reporters at the time, and it kind of stuck, actually. So any white worker that wanted to file any kind of discrimination suit, they called it a reverse discrimination, but discrimination is discrimination. But it has to be reasonable, it has to be true. In 1974, the first year of the plan, at the Gramercy plant, 13 craft trainees were selected, 7 Black and 6 white. The most senior Black had less seniority than several white production workers whose bids were rejected, and they were angry. All right. There were some problems regarding Black and white workers when these plans were implemented. Brian Weber, was one of them, and he issued a class action suit that went through the courts to the highest court. So what was the decision of the court? You see it on the screen. Title VII does not preclude a union and an employer from entering into a negotiated racial conscious affirmative action plan. And the ironic thing is, Brian Weber eventually got into the craft training program not too long after that. And before that, he couldn't, and neither could anyone else, Black, white, or whatever, without the union negotiated plan, would be able to move from production out of a production department into the entry-level craft training programs. What Kaiser was doing up till then, they were hiring already skilled craft workers from outside the union. They weren't doing anything to train and promote within for the workers. Unfortunately, followed the downturn of the steel industry and other major industries due to employers taking their workers' work overseas in great part, and plants started to close, and many Black, Hispanic, and women and white workers became permanently laid off. It was like, you were the last one in, whoever had the less seniority, you're the first one to be laid off. But when there's a plant closing, it affects everybody. When a local television station reported on a closing, they did a program about plant closings of the major steel mills in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania region. Ray Henderson was a former steel mill worker who had worked in the Duquesne mill in Western Pennsylvania for 18 years. And he noticed this. And he said, why aren't there any Black workers shown in this program? Despite the fact that African-American workers had been a critical part of the labor force in Western Pennsylvania for at least 125 years. So he collaborated with a filmmaker to make a documentary showing African-Americans and their contributions, not only to just the steel industry, but to the labor movement itself. And that it's a 60-minute film called Struggles in Steel, and it documents the history of discrimination against Black workers and their heroic struggle for equality on the job. Black workers, since then, the downturn of industries and everything, unions have been, but even with greater force, organized outside their main industries. My union, the steel industry, is a small part composite of my union. We have so many diverse occupations and jobs and places that are now part of our union, and a lot of others. Black workers, however, continue to organize in all these industries, whether it's universities or government service jobs, whatever, including health and services. One of these great organizers was Hattie Canty. She was one of them. She was a room attendant on the Las Vegas Strip. Hattie felt that the labor movement continued the struggle for racial justice. She put the two movements into one, which is the way it should be and the way it should be acted out. She had seen a lot of racial injustice in Alabama, where she was from, and felt these two movements were linked. So she became active in her union, the Culinary Workers Union, CWU, and in 6 years, she became the first Black woman and first room attendant to be elected president in 1990. She served as president of the union during their longest strike in US labor history at the time, leading the workers at the Frontier Hotel. I don't even think that hotel's there anymore, through 6.5 years of negotiations for better labor standards. Hattie is called one of the greatest strike leaders in US history as well. And she was a strong voice for the culinary workers in Las Vegas. And anytime, I know our union at that time had a convention there, and all the convention delegates marched with Hattie to the Frontier Hotel on behalf of the workers, the culinary workers, as well as other unions that had their conventions there and could bring hundreds, some cases thousands of people there. Black workers, this was brought out in part one. Black organizers in the meatpacking industry were referenced in the early part, as in part one. And that union's history during this period depicts how male and female packing house workers in the Midwest, mostly African Americans, experienced racism in the workplace, on the shop floor and on their picket lines. There was the strong link between the civil rights and the labor movement in that fight for economic justice and equality. These workers built a union that would defend their interests and fight for their rights for years to come. And they're still doing it under the UFCW, which is what the union is now. One of these women was Addie Wyatt. Addie Wyatt was a friend of mine. She was the first woman president of her local, the UPWA Local 56. In 1970, she became the first woman international president in the history of the Amalgamated Meat Cutters and the first African-American woman to serve as international vice president of the UFCW, the large union that was merged. She was a mentor to me. We were both co-founders of the Coalition of Labor Union Women. She became its executive vice president. I became their executive vice president. And she was a mentor up until the time she retired, and she's since passed away. And we need more women like Addie and Hattie. And I think we have a lot of them, particularly young women doing that today, young women of color. In 21 and 22, some of you may be familiar because it's been on the news of the fight to organize Starbucks stores in the United States. Over 6,500 workers at over 250 corporate-owned Starbucks stores have voted to unionize with Workers United at the multinational coffee house chain, starting with the store in Buffalo, New York. For the first time since the 1980s, in an ongoing unionization effort, they finally made it. Workers are fed up with low wages and hours and all the things that are common to workers fighting for their rights. Just this week, a 3-member labor panel decision affirmed a judge's findings in 2021 that the coffee chain violated employees' rights repeatedly in late 2019 and early 2020, when coffee baristas were pushing the company to guarantee predictable work schedules and address discrimination based on race and LGBTQ status. It's still happening all over the country. What happened years ago is still happening now. The board ordered Starbucks to offer reinstatement and back pay to, in this case, there were 2 fired workers, Tristan Bussieri and Echo Nowakowska. So these workers are out there, they're just organizing on their own, with or without tying to an international union. Some are and some aren't, but we want them in our fold. Okay. Christopher Smalls, he was fired from his Amazon warehouse job in 2020. This is all going on, some of this during the times of COVID. Not a good time for us, not a good time for workers. He was fired after leading a protest over fears working conditions could lead to a coronavirus outbreak at the Staten Island, New York facility where he worked. He was fired, all right, but he didn't just go find another job or go on unemployment, just unemployment. He traveled across the country protesting and advocating for workers' rights. He said his mission was to educate Amazon workers on the benefits of unionizing in hopes of encouraging them also to fight for a change at their warehouses too. Now, he's got a new job. He's president of the Amazon Labor Union, ALU. Okay. There's a lot to be said during all this time. I could only highlight in the time period that I have of certain things. There's a lot more to put in. We hope to do more of these kinds of programs in the future where we can focus on things more specifically. So much has gone on since then. We had a Black president. We had a Black president who I'm sure the activists of the 60s civil rights movement could only dream of, but probably never really envisioned happened. And then followed by a president. It's like the good and the bad, in my opinion. A president who has brought fire to racism, division, misogyny, and some of the things just from comments and things that he did, and some people who follow him, and his ties with white supremacy who rally around him, is permeating not only in the country, but it's coming into our workplaces where people think it's okay to say derogatory things because of a person's race or color or sex. And they bring that attitude into the workplace. And we have a lot of complaints of discrimination that we have. We still have it with employer to worker, but the majority of harassment issues that we have and the complaints that we're handling internally involve worker to worker harassment. And that's a tough place to be in if you're a union representative, where you have 2 members and you have to represent both members, or they have to get 2 different union representatives to represent them, depending on the consequences. We're also finding hangman's nooses in workplaces. I had a slide that showed all that. I should have included it, but I didn't. As recently as a couple years ago, made out of string, made out of rope, they're drawn and put at a person's workstation, or the ropes or the, I don't know if they're strings, they're not little strings, they're big strings, put by, if it's more of an African American workers' workstations or assembly line or whatever. And those actually are in violation of not only their rights, the rights of a person who is offended by it or who it was directed at, a violation of Title VII, the law, and of our union policy and our collective bargaining agreements. It's also a violation of it's also considered a hate crime. And in some of those places, the FBI actually came in and investigated and met with the union representatives and talked to people who may have been witnesses, the same kind of process we would do internally. So these kinds of things are happening, and it's part of our connection with the civil rights movement that this stops, that laws be enforced, that there be better policies that cover workers. Employers really only, in probably every place, for all of you, your employer, they all have some kind of ethics policy or harassment policy. And they only did that because if they have a policy, that kind of eliminates their liability if there's an EEOC complaint filed against them. So, there's just so much happening out there. And, yes, some people say we're a country divided. Some people don't like to say we're a country divided. But the main thing that we can do, we're union members, is, by making our own history, do whatever we can to unite at least our members and our, the co-workers who are part of our unions, and to make sure that, hopefully some of these things stop. We don't want to see that in our union. I did go over a lot. Maybe there's some things you would have liked to be included that wasn't included. We'll certainly be able to hopefully in the future go further. So we appreciate any comments you have on that. I do have, if you want to contact us, at least by email, you can contact Amanda Green, who is the director of the department, myself, Marcia Zakowski, and Brittany Murray, who presented part 1. And we'll be able to help you for anything that you need or any questions that you have, any more clarification or information that you may have that you feel is important. But there's a lot of things. Some of the things I mentioned, please look into it even more and try to research the history of your own union, the history of the labor movement. A lot of gains were made. The AFL-CIO actually, by a diversity resolution, called on unions to have greater representation at the higher levels of their unions, of the affiliate unions. And a lot of unions were doing that before that diversity resolution came out. My union was one. And now unions, a lot of unions, including the Steelworkers, have women and Black representation. We have Kevin Mapp as our International Vice President for Human Affairs, and women of color as heads of departments, and women representatives throughout our union, as do many unions, and women in, people of color in elected office. And that's what we want to see. And for organizing, we want organizers to reflect and look like the people we're trying to organize. And there's a lot of workers out there, people of color. They make up the greatest proportion of the workplace. Women and people of color are the easiest to organize because they've all experienced some form of discrimination in their life and probably in their workplaces. So there's a great opportunity for us as activists and you as activists to do that kind of work. We're everywhere. And also we're organizing people where there is a lot of LGBTQ plus workers as well. So, putting those movements together, the March on Washington, that was the greatest event in African-American history and civil rights history, but it kind of inspired other marches like the recently, I don't know what year it was, recent years, the LGBTQ community marched on Washington. There has been a women's march on Washington to get out there and let the public know what needs to be done and what they stand for and what they represent and what they want, not only as workers, but as women, citizens, and people of color citizens. So in closing, just to say, out of a history of struggle and gross injustice, the contributions that Black workers, Black organizers, and Black leaders have made and are making to the labor movement and our own unions, if you're in a union, are extraordinary and they can't go unsung. There's so many other leaders who are not really mentioned. There's so many of them you may have heard of or not heard of. You can research and you'll find so many people. I learned so many things in trying to put this presentation together. There are many more not depicted in this program, in our program, but we celebrate them and we share in the gains they made as workers and as activists for economic and social justice for all workers. And I think we can be confident that young Black workers and activists union workers who are activists that are people of color and women and organizers will grow and continue to build their own legacy in one of the greatest movements, the labor movement, and connect with the civil rights struggle. Becoming unionists is one of them, but connecting with the civil rights struggle that still exists by reflection of the 6 constituency groups of the AFL-CIO that you can research if you go on that site. We'll continue connect with the civil rights struggles that still continue and the discrimination that still continues and that faces marginalized workers and people and in the communities where, all unions are out there in the community. We don't just help our members, we help people in the community and we're out there connecting with communities, labor and community together, particularly where the need is greatest in organizing, and that's in those communities who are suffering the most, communities of marginalized workers and people. So I want to thank you at this time. I don't know if anyone has any questions or you have a comment. Or
Marcia, you do have a question.
Sure.
An anonymous attendee, so I can't see who it was, but they asked about the USW's first executive director for civil rights, Alex Fuller. Wondering, I'm guessing they want you to go into detail perhaps about Alex or maybe give some commentary about him. I know that was somebody that you had previously stated you knew and worked with quite a bit.
I couldn't find a picture of him. I have a picture somewhere. I have pictures of us together and with other people. I can't find my pictures right now. So I wanted to include him, but thank you, whoever asked that. Alex Fuller was a steelworker from Detroit, Michigan. He was active in his local. He became an officer in his local, and he 1299, I believe it was, and he became a leader in Michigan. He was on the Michigan Employment Securities Commission and other commissions. I.W. Abel, who was president during some of this time I think he became president in 1964. I'm not sure. I apologize. I should know this. I want to say 68, but I'm not sure. I was like such a kid at the time. But anyway, he was running for office against the incumbent president in the Steelworkers. And Alex Fuller had supported him, and of course, I.W. Abel won as president. And Alex Fuller was very instrumental in getting the Black vote. Our union at that time didn't, I think this was 1965, he brought Alex in. We established a civil rights department. We had like an international committee that actually went out and worked with communities and worked to try to get fair employment laws in states, states throughout the country. They did that kind of work. But Alex was brought in as that, he's an African-American. He was brought in as the first department head. And he lived through all these things with a consent decree. And he was a strong advocate for women's rights, when a lot of other unions and union leaders weren't even talking about the rights of women in their unions or their issues. That's why the Coalition of Labor Union Women was formed, because unions weren't doing enough for women, unions in general. So he came in, and when Alex came in, that's when our union developed a three-tiered program for civil rights. We were out there doing all the things for legislation and working with other groups, but that put an officer over all the civil rights activities of the union, which was a good thing because that officer reported, of course, to the board members who were important, in implementing our program, which is what they did through our districts. We have district directors. Some of you on here may have regional directors or other. And we established the 3-point program from the international level with the officer, he was Joe Maloney at the time, over the civil rights program. And then Alex Fuller, who directed the department and all its activities, and worked with, districts appointed a civil rights coordinator in each district who were the liaisons between the international and our local union members. And in 1942, like the auto workers, 1942, our union had already, started to establish civil rights committees, and also had that constitutional provision not to discriminate. So we had members then who could actually, even though they filed grievances, that's a procedure, could file civil rights complaints that had no time element, that would go to the civil rights department, that would be investigated through the coordinators and with the local unions. We didn't directly deal with local unions, and sometimes we had to. And we worked with the staff representatives in our districts to implement our civil and human rights program. That's the structure we still have today. And also, Alex was on President Johnson's housing committee as well. And I.W. Abel had a close connection with Johnson and Kennedy because of the Civil Rights Act, and Johnson, because after the march, there were riots all over the country. They called them riots back then. I'd like to say there were demonstrations that got heated, and particularly in Watts in California. And Johnson called on our president, Abel at the time, to, because of the work the unions had done in the various communities in our country, to work with him on kind of finding out what happened, what's causing this. This is very in-depth and complicated. I'm really simplifying it. And what can we do about it? So Johnson actually wanted to have a national reaction to it, an actual plan. How do we fix this? People are hurting out there. Communities are hurting. There's not enough housing. There's not enough jobs. There's exclusion. There's segregation. All those in public accommodations. All those things that the legislation was supposed to fix. And so he, what came out of it was called a Kerner report, a Kerner commission, and President Abel was appointed by Johnson to serve on that commission. And it's a lengthy report. You can Google it and probably find the whole report. I think the whole report's on there. on why all these things were happening in our city. And as far as I know, that was the only time, because so much was happening, that there was actually a national response to it, and finding out the details, not only in Watts, but these things were happening all across the city, particularly after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And then you see what's happening today, but I don't have time to go in all of that with what's happening with Black Lives Matter and police. Not all police are bad, but the wrong policemen, the bad actors, they call them, murdering young Black men, mostly, for basically no reason. So anyway, you can look up the Kerner report, and there's a report about that. But I'm very proud, no union's perfect. Our members still have problems. We have to deal with them. We have to know about them. We have to know what's going on in our local. That's why we have civil rights coordinators. We love the work that they're doing. And we work with, of course, Kevin Mapp, who was our International Vice President for Human Affairs. And he succeeded Fred Redmond. And before Fred Redmond was Leon Lynch, he became international. We actually established the office at a 1976 convention. Now back to Alex Fuller. He was my mentor. He was really my mentor, and he got me involved in women's rights. And I learned so much from him, as well as two other technicians that were in our department, Curtis Strong and Jonathan Comer out of Gary, Indiana, Paul Montemayor from Texas. I learned, when you have people working there that have been active, that maybe have been in struggles, learn from them, listen to them, talk to them. They have stories to tell. And that's how I learned. I learned from them. I was sent out to work on complaints with them. I worked my way up by learning, what was going on. And I got that opportunity because of Alex Fuller. So he was a very dear friend of mine. And he's a person I'll never forget for what he did for our union. Maybe he's an unsung hero too, but, he could be a name dropper. He knew everybody. He knew everybody in Congress, everybody in Washington, everybody in Michigan. All the great civil rights leaders were in contact with him all the time, including Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King, who he marched with. So he suffered discrimination too. And I just, as a man, a kind man, a gentle man, a man who cared about and protected the people in his department and worked with the people in his department, certainly in a good way. And in my case, he helped me grow. And he's the reason with IW Able support, that's how far back I go. I was just in kindergarten when I started there. And Joe Maloney, who was over civil rights, basically, then supported me. And that was very helpful, as well as a couple other people. I had mentors, and it's always good to have mentors to learn from and to help you. We can't do it on our own. We all have mentors, black, white, or whatever, so that helped me. Sorry for the long response. Are there any other comments or questions?
Marcia, there was one more question. They asked, what can and should unions be doing about the worker-to-worker harassment that you mentioned?
Well, what we do in our union, when there is worker-to-worker harassment, if one person, we want them to go to their local union civil rights committee representative, the person that's on the end of the harassment. The committee will decide what to do about it. There'll be an investigation. They'll talk to both parties and try to talk to the person who was allegedly accused of the harassment. They may admit it, they did it, they may not, but we have to put them on we have to let them know that our union doesn't tolerate this and the employer doesn't tolerate it. And if the employer finds out about it, depending on what the incident is, they could be disciplined. We don't want our workers disciplined, but we want to solve it. And we'll actually, our department anyway, we'll go in, and where there's issues, in some places there's a lot of discriminatory harassment going on. I'm going to be doing a training with a local that's having these issues in March, doing a training for whether it's a department, whether it's with the local union officers or the committee, so they know how to handle this. And we've done trainings with employers as well regarding, we've been asked to do it because first of all, they get us for free rather than being charged thousands of dollars by consultants. But it's better if we go in and talk to the employees because they're our members and they'd rather listen to a union member talk about these issues. They're very sensitive, but we want it to stop. That's the main thing. It has to stop. And if somebody doesn't stop and they get disciplined, it's going to be hard to represent them. But we encourage a positive workplace culture. We do trainings for that to head off. We do prevention rather than putting out fires. That's what we'd rather do. So that's what unions can do. Some unions may be doing that. Some unions have processes available, but it comes down to talking to workers. And it comes down to implicit bias. Sometimes there's things that people have they might not, there's ways they have of letting people know they're maybe racist, but they may not directly call them names or anything, but there's things that they can do and say that lean towards that. So we don't want people to be bystanders. We want our members, if they see something happening, if they can step in right there to do it, to take care of it on behalf of that member who may be the victim of that harassment. If they don't feel comfortable doing it, it's scared. There's bullies in every workplace, and some of them aren't easy to deal with. If they're not comfortable doing that, they can go to a shop steward or a union representative. But we have trained our committee members to handle these kinds of things in our locals and in our units. We have amalgamated locals, so we do that kind of training. We have a very strong policy against discrimination in our union. We've had it for a long time, and we uphold it, try to uphold it. Does that answer the question? Hello?
They can't respond, but I would hope so. It seems very thorough. The only other comment was from the anonymous attendee. I can't see their name, but they said that Alex Furler was their grandfather, and that they were glad that he could be a mentor to you. And he passed in 1980 when they were only a child. So.
Yes, he passed after he retired from the Steelworkers, and
yes.
we were sorry to see him go. He was just such a good man.
And Laureen says, yes, that answers my question. And thank you. And with that, I don't think we have any other questions.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone again for being on. And like I mentioned, if you have any questions hereafter, you can contact us. All right. Thank you all very much. Good night.